You believe negotiation is a conversation. You think it requires finding a middle ground, offering concessions, and smoothing out the rough edges so everyone leaves the room feeling respected. You have been taught that a good deal means both sides give something up, and that compromise is the ultimate goal of business. If you operate under that framework, you are going to get slaughtered by anyone who actually understands leverage. Compromise is not a strategy. Compromise is what happens when you have failed to build a proper structural advantage before opening your mouth. When you sit down at a table and immediately look for a way to meet halfway, you are bleeding capital, authority, and positioning. Why do the most ruthless negotiators in history rarely raise their voices? Why do the men who architect global, industry-defining acquisitions often sit in total silence, saying less than the junior assistants fetching the coffee? Because dominance is not about being the loudest person in the room. Dominance is a meticulously constructed system. It is a macro structure of variables, timing, physical space, and information asymmetry designed to force the other party to negotiate against themselves. To understand how this system is built, we have to look at a severe liability. It is the summer of 1912. Theodore Roosevelt is running for President of the United States under the Bull Moose Party. His campaign manager, George Perkins, has just executed a massive logistical operation. He has printed 3 million campaign pamphlets. They are bundled, packed, and sitting in rail cars, ready to be distributed across the country. There is a severe problem. At the bottom of a beautiful, stoic photograph of Roosevelt on the cover of the pamphlet is a tiny line of text. It reads, Moffett Studios, Chicago. The campaign never asked for permission to use the photograph under the copyright laws of 1912. The penalty for unauthorized reproduction of a copyrighted photograph was $1 per copy. Perkins has printed 3 million copies. That is a $3 million liability in 1912 money. Today, that translates to roughly $90 million. The campaign is completely broke. They do not have $3 million. If they distribute the pamphlets, the photographer will sue them into oblivion, and the campaign will collapse. If they refuse to distribute the pamphlets and try to reprint them, they miss the critical window for the election, and the campaign collapses. How do you negotiate a favorable outcome when your opponent holds a $90 million gun to your head, and you have absolutely no capital, no time, and no alternative options? Before we answer that, we must examine the physical architecture of leverage. Most people assume leverage is a fixed asset. You either have the money, the power, or the superior product, or you do not. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. Leverage is entirely perceptual. It is about what the other side believes you have. Consider John Pierpont Morgan. At the turn of the 20th century, Morgan essentially functioned as the central bank of the United States. He controlled the economy. When you were summoned to his office at 23 Wall Street, you did not simply walk in and pull up a chair. You were directed to sit in a specific, heavy wooden chair. You could not move it. It was bolted securely to the floor. Why would a banker bolt a guest chair to the floor? Morgan understood the mechanics of vantage points. He placed his own massive oak desk directly in front of the large, southern-facing windows of his office. When you sat in the bolted chair, you had no choice but to face south. The morning sunlight poured directly through the glass and into your eyes. You had to squint. Your pupils contracted, every physical twitch, every nervous swallow, every bead of sweat on your face was entirely illuminated. Morgan, sitting with his broad back to the light, was entirely obscured. He was a massive, dark silhouette. You could not see his eyes. You could not read his facial expressions. You could not establish a baseline for his emotional state. He manufactured a structural asymmetry of information before a single word of business was discussed. He could read your physiological responses. You could Only stare into the blinding sun. This is a macro system of control. You manipulate the physical environment to degrade the opponent's confidence while protecting your own data. You control the lighting, the seating, the temperature, and the time of day the meeting takes place. You force the opponent into a physical state of subtle discomfort. When the human body is uncomfortable, the brain seeks a quick resolution. They will concede terms simply to escape the environment. Let us return to George Perkins and the 3 million illegal campaign pamphlets. Most people in Perkins' position would panic. They would get on the fastest train to Chicago. They would sit down in Moffat's photography studio. They would confess the mistake. They would plead for mercy, offering maybe $5,000 to settle the matter quietly, hoping the photographer takes pity on them. That is negotiating from a compromised vantage point. That is walking into Morgan's office and staring into the sun. Perkins understood that Moffat did not know about the 3 million pamphlets. The liability only existed if Moffat knew the campaign had already committed the copyright infringement. How do you invert a $90 million liability into an asset using only information asymmetry? Perkins does not go to Chicago. He does not apologize. He sends a brief, tightly worded telegram to the photographer. The telegram reads, "We are planning to distribute 3 million pamphlets with Roosevelt's picture on the cover. It will be great publicity for the studio we use. How much will you pay us to use yours? Respond immediately." Look at the structural shift. Perkins built a completely new vantage point. He restricted the flow of information. Moffat saw only an opportunity for nationwide exposure. Perkins shifted the entire framework of the negotiation from "how much do we owe you for our mistake" to "how much will you bid for this exclusive privilege?" Moffat received the telegram and quickly replied, "We have never done this before, but under the circumstances, we will offer $250. Perkins accepted the money. He saved the presidential campaign $90 million in liability and generated a $250 profit. All because he understood that leverage is manufactured through the careful control of what the other party knows. You must learn to manipulate information and silence exactly the way Morgan manipulated light. Why do human beings instinctively hate a vacuum in conversation? We are socially conditioned from childhood to smooth over social friction. When there is a gap in dialogue, our brains interpret it as a threat, a sign of disapproval or hostility. We rush to fill the dead air with words. In a negotiation, the person who speaks to fill the silence is the person who loses the leverage. You must implement the rule of the flinch. When the opposing party names a price or dictates a term, you do not counter-offer. You do not argue. You condition yourself to physically flinch, a slight wince, a sharp intake of breath, a look of profound disappointment. Then you look down at your notes and you say absolutely nothing. You let the silence stretch, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a full minute. You sit perfectly still. What happens in that silence? The other party's internal monologue begins to race. They start negotiating against themselves. Because they cannot tolerate the dead air, they will jump back in to relieve the pressure. They will say, "Of course, that number is just a starting point." They will say, "We might be able to adjust the timeline." You have not spoken a single syllable. You have not offered a single counter-argument. Yet you have already won major concessions purely by weaponizing silence. Silence is a heavy, blunt instrument. Let the other side crush themselves under the weight of it. To execute this, you must build a macro structure of detachment. You never enter a room without a predefined exit. Your walkaway point must be a mathematical certainty, not an emotional decision made in the heat of the moment. If you do not have a walkaway point, you are not negotiating. You are a hostage. The person who needs the deal the least dictates the terms of the deal. Need is a poison. If you project need, the opposing party will smell it, and they will extract every ounce of value from you. Let us look at Morgan one last time. It is 1907. The United States banking system is collapsing in a massive panic. Trust companies are failing. Depositors are pulling their money out of the banks. The government has no central bank to stop the bleeding. Morgan summons the 50 most powerful bankers in New York to his private library. These are men with massive egos. They are bitter rivals. They do not want to cooperate, and they certainly do not want to hand over their own capital to save their competitors. How do you force 50 hostile, terrified billionaires to surrender their liquidity when they have every incentive to hoard it? Morgan does not give a passionate speech. He does not beg. He employs total structural dominance. He waits until they are all inside the library. Then, he walks over to the heavy brass doors, locks them from the inside, and puts the key in his pocket. He traps them. He then walks into the adjoining room, sits down at a mahogany table, and begins playing solitaire. He lets the panic and the exhaustion marinate. He controls the physical space by locking the doors, and he controls the temporal space by refusing to engage. He lets them argue with each other for hours. The air fills with cigar smoke. The men grow tired, hungry, and desperate. All night they hear nothing but the sharp snap of Morgan's playing cards hitting the table in the next room. At 4:45 in the morning, when their physical and mental defenses are completely shattered, Morgan walks into the room. He holds a contract committing them to a $25 million bailout pool. He does not ask them if they agree with the terms. He does not ask for their feedback. He walks up to Edward King, the head of the trust companies. Morgan places the paper on the desk. He points a thick finger at the bottom of the page. He says, "There's the place, King, and here's the pen." He hands the pen to King. King is too exhausted to fight. King signs it. Once the leader signs, the rest of the bankers fall in line. The panic of 1907 is stopped. Morgan won because he controlled the system. He controlled the locks on the doors. He controlled the time on the clock. He removed all alternatives. You must apply this architecture to your own dealings. Stop treating negotiations as collaborative discussions. Build your vantage points. Restrict your information. Use silence to force unforced errors. Control the physical environment. Know exactly where your exit is, and be entirely willing to walk through it. You do not win a negotiation at the table. You win it in the structural design you build before you ever sit down.